is Eric McClendon, and I'm here to discuss the glaring flaws of the standardized testing system in public schools. This is my colleague Connor Fitzgerald, who will be advocating for standardized testing and its applications for public schooling and judging the effectiveness of our learning system.
As often as the subject of standardized testing comes up, people seem to have a real lack of data about it when they're talking about it. The truth is that standardized testing works pretty well, not perfectly, but since, for example, ex-President Bush began his No Child Left Behind policy in 2000, fourth grade math scores have risen some average of 9 points, which is not insignificant for a math test result. The truth is our system of public education is more or less broken. And if we're going to fix it, we need to know which teachers are good and which are bad. And the reality of standardized testing is that it is a way of testing schools and teachers as much or more than it is a means of testing students. A lot of people have the same idea that we ought to pay teachers better, that if it were a more prized position with a six-figure salary, that we would get better quality teachers. But if you look at the system we have now, which of those teachers should we pay better? How do we distinguish between the ones that are good teachers getting the job done and those that are just kind of coasting? So it wouldn't make sense to take the present system and just insert six-figure salaries into it. Where standardized testing comes in is when people want to have a measure or a scale to judge both schools and teachers by. Schools' funding, in the case of many of these tests, is tied to the students' average results on standardized tests. And in some cases, for example, with the recent Florida law for merit pay, pay raises for teachers are tied to the improvement of their students. And the truth is that while imperfect, those are really the only measures we have for gauging how well a teacher is doing with their specific students and how well the school in general is doing dealing with their student population.
Frankly, standardized testing doesn't work. Since the enactment of President Bush's No Child Left Behind Act, a major factor in the explosive use of standardized testing across the nation, our literacy rate and our numeric comprehension rate internationally has fallen even farther than it previously was. One of the many negative effects of standardized testing across the nation is a narrowing of curriculum, a stifling of creativity, and a practice known as teaching to the test, which in many ways our students are suffering as a result of. But we all know the real purpose of standardized testing isn't to test what our students know, but rather to evaluate the effectiveness of our teachers, of our school systems. Standardized testing is not only unfair to the students, but it's unfair to the teachers as well, because it fails to take into account many factors such as the socioeconomic background of the students taking the test, because there's a very obvious correlation between household income and the scores on the standardized test. The fact that teachers' pay is based on how well their students perform on standardized testing is pushing many aspiring young teachers who would seek to make a difference in poor quality school systems are being pushed away. There are, however, other ways in which we can measure the performance of our teachers. Many of the advocates for standardized testing would suggest that there is no other way besides standardized testing to find out how well our teachers are performing. In a recent TED Talk with Bob Sternberg, president of the American Psychology Association, Sternberg talks about a new testing program called Panorama, which tests not only your analytical and practical sense, but it also tests your creative and wisdom-based skills. This is one of many ways that we could replace standardized testing. Or we could just take the obvious solution, which would be to cut out the middleman and stop forcing our students to test as a way to figure out if our teachers are doing well, but rather to make our teachers take evaluation tests.
In the sense that my opponent talks about it, standardized testing is an unfortunate necessity nobody likes being tested, and many teachers don't like taking out the time from their schedule to administer the test and to prepare their students for them. But if we're going to move toward a system where teachers are well paid and exceptionally competent, we have to get a picture of which teachers are exceptional, which aren't, and which schools are exceptional, which aren't, and reward the good results, and try to weed out the less positive academic results. And we need to identify where students are developing most of their problems. Without some kind of testing tool, we have no means of analyzing the educational data we get. In a June 1997 speech on educational standards, former president, and I would point out, standardized testing advocate Bill Clinton pointed out that since his administration began its testing policies, we discovered a gap. Our fourth grade students were testing about average compared to students internationally, but by the eighth grade they were well behind. This is a problem that needs fixing, and it's a problem that without standardized testing we wouldn't have noticed was there. So there are a number of aspects in which standardized testing, whatever its merits as a means of testing students or teachers in schools, is an analytical tool that we need.
My opponent would suggest that standardized testing is a necessary tool for analyzing where our students are suffering and closing an ever-growing gap between fourth grade and high school students and their test scores. He mentioned a statistic that suggested that fourth graders were scoring on average 9 points higher on standardized testing, and that gap was getting better as a result of that. But what he failed to mention is that our high school students are scoring increasingly lower, which suggests that the gap is getting even larger from fourth grade to high school. Some of the other negative results of standardized testing would be a narrowing of curriculum. As I mentioned in my introduction, the curriculum narrows because the teachers begin teaching to the test. Rather than teaching a comprehensive curriculum, they teach you how to pass a fill-in-the-bubble test. And even if standardized testing was an accurate tool for measuring our students' performance, they're not really very heavily enforced. Students fail the test and get pushed on to the next grade anyway. And when it comes time for the test to graduate, if the student doesn't pass the test after a couple of times, they're so demoralized that they typically drop out of school. Standardized testing is also undermining student engagement within classes. As I said before in my introduction, it is stifling their creativity. It is forcing them to memorize test-taking tricks and massive quantities of information that aren't really necessary in the learning process. I would also like to suggest that there is more correlation between your socioeconomic background and your test results than there is in IQ test results and SAT test results. The more money you have, the more you can afford tutors, and the better you're going to do on these standardized tests.
The truth is that in the sense that my opponent talks about it, there are problems with standardized tests, but in a larger sense, those are the same problems with the educational system we are attempting to evaluate with tests. But as I say again, not to put aside its effect on students, but what we really need it for is evaluating good and bad teachers, and this is the real purpose of standardized testing. Identifying good teachers and rewarding them exactly as they would be rewarded in, for example, a totally private-owned educational system. This is an article of faith for many of us who support standardized testing, that we might benefit from a system that was run more like private enterprise, and in that sense, we need to take stock and inventory of what's there already. As one prominent testing advocate put it, we need standardized testing to provide basic info about how schools are doing relative to each other. In the current debate over testing, it's easy to forget this is actually very useful info for improvement purposes, and that we have used this info. For other purposes, it is often the case that discussion of standardized testing focuses on the punitive accountability measures. cutting funding from schools, denying teachers raises and that stuff. But when we get caught up in that debate, we take our eyes off of the very real benefits in terms of comparing schools to one another. But in a larger sense, my opponent does identify problems with standardized testing, but those are, in many ways, problems with the educational system. They're embedded in socioeconomic background, for example. It's true that, and there's plenty of evidence indicating that poorer students do less well on standardized testing, but they do less well in school as well, so it's still a result that we need to know.
So my opponent pointed out something that all standardized test advocates tend to point out, and that is that we need to be able to identify our good and bad teachers, and their pay should be based on their merit. And I agree with that largely, but there are so many factors outside of the teacher's control that affect the test scores. As I said previously, socioeconomic background of the student is a leading factor in how well the student does on the test, and that's outside of the teacher's control, and therefore you should not base the teacher's pay on the socioeconomic background of their students. I mean, you have teachers in some of the poorest districts that are buying their own supplies so that they can attempt to teach these kids to the best of their ability. And as you cut funding to these schools that perform poorly, it kicks off a cycle of even poorer test scores. When a school scores poorly on the test, their funding gets cut. So they lose a lot of their curriculum material, they lose a lot of their tutoring material, they lose a lot of everything. And so even more burden is placed on the teachers that they can't pick up with their already low pay, which forces even lower test scores, which causes another cut to funding, which causes lower test scores and another cut to funding, and so on and so forth, until ultimately you're going to have schools in a lot of districts closing down because they just can't bridge that gap.
The truth with tests and their effect both on students and teachers is that the tests are flawed. All tests are flawed, as all curriculum is flawed, and there is no perfect grading measure that sums up the entire educational experience of a student. As often as opponents of standardized testing talk about preferable educational systems in Sweden or Finland or Japan, they fail to take note of the fact that those countries also practice standardized testing. So if the issue is with how we do standardized testing, that's a different issue than whether we should do it at all. But all of the testing is going to be flawed. I'm sure that there are a lot of doctors and lawyers who would prefer to avoid certification testing. So would a lot of drivers, frankly, but I wouldn't necessarily be comfortable driving on the road with them. We continue to test them anyway so that we can identify unsafe drivers, and that is really what we're attempting to do. We're attempting to isolate and locate the most problematic areas of the system we've got now and fix them. And so if opponents of testing are opposed to any form of evaluation of students' performance over time and how a school is doing, then it needs to be replaced, the testing needs to be replaced with some other method of assessing teachers. Otherwise, we have no way of analyzing the data and improving our results.
You know, without having meant to, I believe that my opponent brings up a very good point in this whole testing issue. If the issue is how well our teachers are doing, why do we not just make our teachers pass more rigorous certification? Why do we not make them periodically take recertification tests so that we can gauge whether or not they are still good teachers? Why should the students have to get caught up in the crosshairs of us trying to figure out who is teaching good and who is not? And contrary to his belief as a non-standardized testing advocate, as an opponent, I don't think that we should do away with all forms of measuring our students. I just think that there should be some more comprehensive test that tests skills other than just filling in a bubble. I think that we should have a test like they do in many of those foreign countries that he mentioned that test skills other than just math and reading comprehension. They should test creativity. They should test problem-solving abilities. They should be higher order thinking tests.